buzzers muted, aren't they?
Oh yeah. So today we'll be covering performance management, as you know. So we'll be going through the details that are on the agenda slide there. So Jenny's going to take the first few sections and run through the driving performance and dealing with performance issues. And then what I'll do is I'll look to cover the more legal side of things, so capability, disability, and the exciting case law we've got noted at the end, which everyone loves a bit of. And then as Kay mentioned, we'll do questions at the end. So Jenny, if you'd like to take over.
Absolutely, yeah, go for it. If you could be my clicker on the slides, and that would be super, and just whiz through to the next one. So yeah, like Rebecca said, I'm going to deal with all the really nice stuff when it comes to performance, and it's a bit like good cop, bad cop today, how we're going to do it. I'm the lovely HR professional who makes the world rosy, pink and fluffy, which I always like to say, and Rebecca is the bad cop, legal eagle, who helps you get to dismissal. But I'm going to absolutely caveat that with a bit of a message that we all know that performance isn't about managing someone out of the business. It's got a bad rep, we'll talk about it, but it's not about that. So we're going to teach you today, hopefully, to think about performance management in a different light, and to understand how it can actually bring benefit to your business, and some of the key tips and practices that you need to be thinking about when you're introducing that into your business. So first of all then, normally if we're in a workshop type session, I'd open this out to the floor, but it's a little bit different really in a virtual setting. If you want to answer any of the questions, I'll put your thoughts forward. If there are any questions that are on the screen, then feel free. But ultimately what we do need to do is address, why do we even bother managing performance? Why don't we just let everybody go on their way doing their own thing? And surely that's going to be easier than us actually having to manage people. Well, obviously the answer is obvious, that it's a bit wrong. You can't really just let everyone crack on. And ultimately the main reason why we do need to manage performance is so that the business goals and the people within our organisation are aligned. And it's all about that business and people alignment. Very much when you have a business strategy, you will also have a sales strategy, you'll have a marketing strategy, you will even have an operational strategy. You'll be even thinking about renovations for the business and that timeline of planning of what's going to happen when. What you won't often have is a people strategy. So what we need to do is we need to use people management to actually work towards the alignment of what our people are doing versus our business goals. So that's why we manage performance, thinking about keeping everyone on the straight and narrow. And ultimately, what issues could arise if we don't do that? Well, they are misaligned. They're off on a tangent. They're following their own dreams, their own priorities. They're not being managed accordingly. We're having a great time because we're just focusing on the operational side of the business. We're managing ourselves. But if we're not managing the people around us, then ultimately they are just off on a frolic of their own. What's worse, I think, if we actually have performance management in a business, but we do it completely wrong, or we do it a little bit wrong, or we just have a bit of a process that's maybe a bit inconsistent, maybe manage one department a different way to another department. So ultimately, it becomes unfair. And obviously, in HR, we love fairness and consistency. So we need to think about applying that throughout the process. So we don't want an unfair process at all. We don't want any sort of bias or unconscious bias to slip in there, where an individual can easily say, well, Johnny, my manager, or Bill, I always use Bill doesn't like me, and therefore that's why he's managing me more than he's managing another individual. But ultimately, if we get it wrong, one of the main risks is a breakdown of trust. They don't know why we're bothering doing this, and I say they, I mean the staff. They think that we're trying to get them. They think that we're micromanaging them. They don't understand it. So we lose that trust factor. And worst case scenario, and here comes the scary bit, we might end up in a tribunal because they might say we're discriminating against them and we're picking on them because they're a woman and we're not managing their male counterparts correctly, or they're of a certain age, or they're of a certain race, for example. And then back onto the softer side, we're thinking about disengagement. So because we're leaving them to their own devices, we're thinking that we're giving them autonomy. Well, actually what we're doing with our workforce is disengaging them because we're leaving them alone too much and we're not keeping them on the straight and narrow. So all basic really, but some things we often forget when we think about performance management. Our boss, Chris Boyle, head of employment, loves the why, and it's really, really important that we remember the why when we're thinking about performance management. Why are we bothering going through that? And that's just some basics. Let's think now about what performance management is. Well, I touched on it before. It's got a really bad reputation. I'm sure in organisations in the past, maybe you've heard the phrase, I'm going to performance manage that person out of the business. It's got this really bad reputation in the sense that it's a punishment or a sanction. I'm sorry if you can hear that dog at the side of me. It's the neighbour's dog, obviously wants to come in after its morning ablutions. Really sorry about that. Hopefully they'll let it in a minute because it's really badly raining outside. It's certainly not a punishment or a sanction like that dog's being subjected to at the moment. You don't leave your employees out in the cold. It's not a scare tactic, it's not a threat, and it's not to be completed unsupported. And what I mean by that is essentially an employee doesn't just manage themselves, we manage them together. So it's a joint process when we're thinking about one-to-ones, we're thinking about appraisals, and specifically with appraisals, the actual appraisal meeting, either a 6-month point or perhaps an annual appraisal, it's not a surprise. It's a summary meeting of the last 12 months or 6 months, that review period. So it's a conclusion to everything you've been discussing, as opposed to it being, oh my gosh, I've got my appraisal meeting now. What score am I going to get? You would always expect an employee would know what they were on track with and what needed further support. If anything, it's performance management is a supportive tool as opposed to a punishment. And as Rebecca will talk about later on, it's certainly a long process when it comes to looking to exit an employee. It's not for that at all. So it's not something we can rely on to dismiss an employee quickly at all, and necessarily even safely, really. So let's think about high performance. And you might have heard the phrase high performance workplaces. And ultimately, that's where performance management is specifically key in driving that performance. So it's less of monitoring and review, it's more of driving key performance. And it's a cycle, and it doesn't ever stop. But we use this not only just when we're thinking about one-to-ones and appraisals, but also in your daily communications with your staff. So we're thinking about softer skills here, where even on a very basic level of a day-to-day basis, you'll have these types of conversations. Let's take a really basic example. You would expect an employee to come to work on time every single day. And let's just apply this model to it. So the objective and the expectation for that employee is, hi Bill, I expect you to turn up at 10 to 9 every single day and be ready at your workstation to start answering the phones and looking after the customers by 9 o'clock. That's the objective. Really, really simple. If we think about the ongoing discussions that we need to have with that particular employee, it's very basic, but if that employee has perhaps previously struggled to turn up on time and is now improving their performance, we would note that by having regular ongoing conversations with them and feedback. Well done, Bill. I know it sounds ridiculous and we're treating Bill like a toddler now, but well done, Bill. You've been coming to work on time and I've seen that you've really made an improvement in your performance. That's great. Secretly, internally as a manager, you're probably thinking, for God's sake, is it really that difficult for Bill to come to work on time? However, you're doing the right thing and you're smiling and you're saying, Bill, it's been recognised, keep up the good work. However, if Bill is late, what we do is we timely speak to him. And if that bus is late one day, we say, oh, what happened today, Bill? Noticed you came in at 10 past. You spot it straight away, you're on it, and you're making a little note of it, and that's particularly important. So you can give him feedback so he knows that the expectation is still very much to come to work on time. Consistently measuring and evaluating against the objectives to push it forward. And maybe speaking to Bill about, maybe does he want to change his hours ever so slightly? Could that work better for the business? Could you be thinking more about him working flexibly and what that will do in terms of benefits for the organisation, and discussing that whilst you're measuring and evaluating his attendance and his timekeeping. And then moving on to show, well, actually, we've moved from Bill being on time all the time and being particularly good, to thinking about him working extra hours or committing himself in other areas and really focusing on his career journey. And we can see now he's a trusted employee who consistently attends work on time, and we can start to develop that. And then we move on to the next objective, or we might have a number running alongside. So a very, very basic example of how the cycle can work in its most basic form, as well as when we're setting objectives, such as make sure you're hitting your KPIs, thinking about your sales target, how are your team developing, are you developing a service strand, for example, in its most basic form. And it all boils down to communication, constant, regular, documented communication. Obviously in HR, we love writing things down, keeping notes, filing things in personnel files. It's the Bible. Make sure when you're speaking to Bill about his lateness, you're writing it down, and write down what he says back to you as well. It's consistent, it's important. For other people, it will seem like the biggest waste of time ever, but trust me, if that matter eventually goes down a formal process, when we'll cover that later on, you will rely on those conversations that you've documented with Bill about the 591 bus and its lateness, and the annoying driver who always seems to take the wrong route. So let's move on to think about motivation. Still continuing on the softer skills that's required as a line manager, we have to get into our employees' psyche. And this is really important when we're thinking about not breaking trust. We're thinking about building that trust in that cycle and developing the high performance workplace. But to do that consistently, what we need to do is understand what motivates them. Now, the only way we can understand what motivates an employee is to actually speak to them and understand that. And you would do that through one-to-one conversations. You would also do that by, back in the old day when we were allowed to properly and consistently work in the office, little coffee chats by the photocopier, or, in the corridor, or as you're passing on the corridor to the loo, that type of thing. What have you been doing at your weekend? And then you understand what they really like to enjoy and are motivated by. A common misconception is that money motivates everyone. It does to a point, absolutely. And there's a lot of studies out there which have actually shown, in relation to engagement and motivation, that you can continue to pay an employee an increased salary over a period of time, and it will continue to motivate them and engage them. However, there's a peak for everyone, where the study showed that if you continued to pay over a certain cap for a certain role, that the engagement level actually dropped off. And it wasn't until you started mixing extrinsic and intrinsic benefits, the stuff that you can't actually touch and feel, that motivation began to go on the up again. So this is where we think about skills, and we think about career development and training. We think about the workplace environment, where they like to sit. Do they like a window? Do they want their own office? I'm not saying that we should obviously have corner offices, or no skyscraper for everyone, but thinking about how we can make a working environment a nicer place for an employee to work. Thinking about, can we do sideways moves in relation to training and development? Can we give them a particular product to look after? Can we think about making them a buddy in a buddy system, so that they actually train junior members of the team? Even things along the lines of a champion in relation to perhaps well-being or engagement or fun in the workplace. All sorts of different elements which we could use to motivate an employee. And this will come in particularly handy when we need to start addressing poor performance, because if we understand what makes them tick, then we can understand what will help push them, but also if we maybe remove items from them or elements of their work, what they'll be particularly unhappy with, and therefore what they'll want to try and win back, as it were. So We use this when we're thinking about performance issues, but this is a very brief guide to what we would use as a structure for a conversation when dealing with poor performance. And we can use this informally or formally. Still in the informal section of dealing with performance management, but ideally it's just really 5 key points what you're looking at. It's not war and peace at all. You're looking to be specific when identifying the issues. Is it one issue or is it a number of issues? Now, if we use Bill's example, and that was Bill not being able to come into work on time, and we'll discuss later on, is it that he can't come to work or is it that he won't come to work on time, and the difference between that. We identify the gap. What's missing? Well, in Bill's case, 15 minutes of time was missing for him. So we need to work out what it is we actually want. So what's the current performance, but what's the performance we want to see moving forward? And then think about a timescale for improvement. Now, this is probably one of the most difficult questions that you'll ever deal with when it comes to managing performance. What is a reasonable amount of time for an employee to improve? And again, I'm saying this a lot, we'll cover this in more detail later. But essentially, the key to remember here, it's on a case-by-case basis. There is not really a right or wrong answer because it's to each individual situation and each individual employee who is actually carrying out that task. For example, you would expect a newly qualified or appointed individual to take longer to get to a certain standard than an individual who had been doing the job for 10 years, for example. So it's taking things like length of service into consideration, the task at hand, the support, the training that they're going to get as well. And then ultimately a review date. You wouldn't believe it, but this is actually one of the most forgotten elements of this particular structure. That what people do is they say, I want an immediate improvement, and they think that's enough. What you need to do is set that review period again. So you would be well within your right if it was appropriate to say the behaviour I would like to see, or the performance, or you hitting your target, or that achievement of that particular project needs to be hit and needs to be done within the next 2 weeks. But what you need to do is do the rubber stamp on that and say, and as such, I'll put some time in the diary for us to reconvene and look at that together. And that's that full circle of you summarising, evaluating, reviewing. Without that, then how can we actually check that it was right? So that's really important. Obviously, throughout the conversation, and whilst it's at the last point, you would be providing support and training to the individual. But rather than you saying, what support and training do you need? You would be asking the individual themselves as they go through, what have you perhaps tried in the past that maybe didn't work? Or how do you like to learn? Obviously, we all know that individuals learn differently. So is it the particular, are they kinetic with their learning? Are we thinking about visual aids? How are we supporting them to achieve that as well? But are they buying into that themselves? Are they the one coming up with ideas themselves? Or are they saying to you as a manager, what are you going to do to help me? That says that they're trying to pass the buck. So make sure you're turning it round on that employee and say, well, what do you think you need? What have you gone away and thought about? And make sure they're really invested in that. But as I mentioned at the outset, these principles work well with informal conversations as well as formal conversations because it adds that element of structure and helps you record that conversation in just those 5 key points, really. So, when all else fails and we're struggling informally to improve performance, we need to pull out a couple of bits in our armoury, really. Ultimately, reward good performance. And for those of you who've got children, it is a little bit like managing a child. Reward good performance. Don't focus entirely on the negative, but push what you want to see. And those rewards aren't always financial rewards. That's not what we're advocating at all. And certainly an appraisal is not an opportunity for an employee to solely ask for a pay rise. That's not the key at all to the appraisal process. But we're thinking about rewards in terms of recognition as well. So employee of the month even, being mentioned on a newsletter, having a spotlight feature on them, reward in terms of taking a particular element of a team meeting and building confidence that way, but actually sharing a good story that happened in relation to something that employees done and getting the spotlight that way. Thinking about how we can persuade and coach an employee to improve, addressing with them what the benefits of their improvement are, not only to themselves as individuals and their performance, but also thinking about the benefits to the team, their colleagues, the wider team around them in the business, and also explaining to them how they slot in to the organisation's objectives. It's always really a bit easier for individuals to see where they're going if you've been honest and open with them in relation to their performance, but specifically into how they fit into the organisation, connecting the dots for them. And a lot of feedback that I get is that employees just don't really know what they're trying to achieve themselves. They don't understand what their performance has in terms of an impact onto the business itself. So if you're actually really clear and share information and be transparent with your team, you actually find that something clicks and they get it, and for them that's their why as well. Obviously, no negotiation. When we are thinking about managing performance, there might be a particular target, maybe if we just take it as bare bones, that an employee thinks is perhaps unachievable. Well, first of all, we need to understand why they feel it's unachievable. What are their blockers around that? But it might be that we've not got a hard and fast, this is what you need to achieve, that we're entering into negotiation with the employee, and that we're working in partnership with them for them to say, well, actually, I think I can achieve 75% of that, for example, by that date, or we're moving the goalpost slightly for them. They're more likely to improve and to get to that level if they feel they've had a say in that objective as well. That's not obviously letting them sort of bowl us over and say, well, we're just going to let you only improve in the next 18 months. That's not what we're trying to do, but definitely work in partnership with them. Like I said, it's the supportive nature of performance management we're going with them. Improving the working environment. It could be an individual has a chatterbox sat next to them. There's a number of colleagues in my team that don't like sitting next to me, and there's a reason for that, because I like to talk. So I take myself off sometimes to a quiet room. But in all seriousness, some people like a bit more of a quieter environment. They don't like to have the phone on all the time. They want to have the ringer on silent, all that sort of thing. So we're thinking about really basic levels here. They might be sat next to a door where people are constantly walking through, or it's drafty and uncomfortable, all sorts of other things like that. And it does feel a little bit like, if you're maybe an old school sort of manager, that maybe we might be mollycoddling people here. We're not. The ultimate goal that we're just trying to remember is we want them to achieve that objective as quickly as possible. It's not mollycoddling if ultimately we get the goal that we want. It's just us being reasonable, and it's just us being flexible and working with them. Cancelling could be an option, because one of the underlying causes maybe of a capability issue could be that an individual is struggling with something, and we'll cover what looks like in terms of ill health and disability as well in the more serious nature. But it could be they just need some actual support. They need to speak to someone going with they're having some true difficulties, either in relation to actually achieving a performance issue, or perhaps at home, maybe that's impacting their performance and whatnot. So we need to offer that counselling, coaching support that we can, either internally or externally. And then worst case, and you notice it's at the right at the bottom, discipline. And that's where we think about, is it performance issue? Is it a conduct issue? And which method of formal action would we take on that? And we'll cover that as we go through. That's when legal Rebecca is taking a look at that. So we've covered quite a lot there. There's a model that I like using in terms of giving feedback, because one of the main issues or concerns that when I'm speaking to managers and I'm mentoring managers from HR angle on giving feedback and communication generally, is how do they give poor feedback? How do they really get that through to the employee without doing that sandwich that I don't really like? I won't say its actual full name because this is being recorded and there's an expletive in there, but there's a sandwich of feedback that you can give that I'm not really that fond of, that kind of just goes around the houses really, and you forget what you've said. But this model is called the EEC model, so Echo, Echo, Charlie. And what that stands for is example, effect, continue, or change, depending on what you want to do. It can be used for positive feedback as well as negative feedback as well. And it's a very simple model for us to use, for us to really get across to the employee what's happened that was either poor or that was good. So being specific with the example, and on the slide you will see it says there's an employee that's been making a series of errors in a specific letter to one of the key customers that we have. And what they've been doing is they've been promising impossible service delivery dates. Well, that's just not ideal in itself. The customer is upset at the service's failure to meet targets. They're so upset, in fact, what they've done is they've threatened to withhold payment. And they've actually said that they're really worrying about whether they've got a continued relationship with us. It's gone quite far in this example. And how we would use that is we would say to the employee that was responsible, that we'd maybe pinpointed to writing to that particular client, we would say, we have noted that we've reviewed some of your letters, and ultimately we can see that the timescales you've been quoting have been incorrect. The effect of that is that client is extremely disgruntled, and they've actually threatened to take some business away from us and not work with us anymore. But they're actually now threatening to withhold payment as well because we've not met those service deadlines. And that's the middle part. The next bit would be, as a result of, well, moving into the next bit would be, as a result of that, obviously that's going to affect our cash flow as a business, and ultimately we're going to potentially lose our reputation in terms of that impact to reputation, but also, in this example, we're potentially going to lose the huge amount of revenue, the disruption as well to the finance team, in that they're going to have an increased amount of administration to chase those payments, and obviously the sales team having to speak to that disgruntled client and smooth the waters. We may even have to give them some kind of free product or discount on their next order. Therefore, the change is that if you are unsure about any letters that you're writing in terms of timescales and the up-to-date delivery targets that we're working towards, you need to ask. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some training about how to draft this letter. I'm going to show you where the templates are, and you're going to sit with Bill's on there again, and Shadow to make sure you draft a letter correctly, and also that your timescales are correct. So we're being as specific as we possibly can so that we can really push home what the issue has been with that particular customer, and that the employee can see the effect that that's caused, so they understand why. Again, what's the bigger picture, not the fact that they've just messed up and, oh, it's all right, somebody else will solve it, but they can really take ownership of it. And obviously when we're giving feedback, we're thinking about documenting that continuously. One of the things that we use quite often in performance management is SMART objectives, or SMART targets, as they're also commonly used. Now, some people love them and some people hate them. That's absolutely fine. One thing I will always caveat SMART targets with is it's really difficult sometimes to fit an objective directly into a SMART target. And what people do is get really, really hung up on that, and that they think, oh, right, well, I can't put a time frame on it as specific as I want it to be, or it's not really as relevant as I'd like it to be. So what they do is they get hung up on trying to fit everything into the acronym rather than focus on the actual objective itself. Disclaimer, it's absolutely fine if all your first letters aren't covered off. As long as it's generically there, that's fine to do. And the most important ones are specific, measurable, and achievable for me. In my experience, what I've been dealing with, those first 3 letters are the most important one. Now, specific is exactly what it says. Now, if I've seen some absolutely corking objectives in my time, and one of the best ones I ever saw was, I want to be a better person. Now, I think, you know, as an objective, I think, you know, there's nothing really wrong with that at all. There's nothing at all. Being a better person, what a great objective. But in the context of work, being a better person, what does that actually mean? Does that mean you want to be a better warehouse operative? I forget what the, it was a gentleman. I forget what the gentleman said his job title was. But what does it mean? Is it a better warehouse operative? Is it a better manager? Is it a better salesperson? Is it a better doctor? What is it? So what do you want to specifically be better at? And I think that's the question. What do you want to be better at? And really drill down on that. So therefore you'd be thinking about, is it a better communicator? Is it a better leader? And again, drill further down. Well, what is it about your communication skills that you're not very good at? Is it being better at giving constructive feedback, all that sort of thing? And really drill down. And that's where your role as a manager is vitally important. So when an employee, and it will happen, not the better person, I mean, but if anyone does ever get that, just let me know, because that would be lovely to share that story. When someone says to you, this is my objective, drill down, make sure as a manager, you're asking why, and what does that mean? And really drill down on it. Because then the second one, measurable, is really, really easy to achieve on that one. Because what does that mean, and how can you measure it? Well, for example, being a better manager, for example, you might be looking to gather the feedback of the direct reportees. So that's how you can measure that. And you would be looking to achieve that over a period of time. And is it achievable? Achievable in the sense that we're going to provide training and support for the individual to be a better manager and learn those skills. And is it relevant? Well, yes, they're a manager, so they do need those skills. And is it time bound? Well, let's think about the courses that are available, and do we have a sequence of courses that are actually coming up in the next 12 months, and therefore would we want to see some improvement immediately within the next 3 months, 6 months, or is it the completion of all the courses? So that's how that fits in really, really loosely. A lot of managers set objectives at appraisals. Again, that's absolutely fine, because you might be looking back at the previous year, but then looking forward at the future year. But you can set them at one-to-ones as well, and you can set them at mini stages. So you don't have to be the big objective, your 12-month objective, but you can have little objectives to say, well, you're looking at the project, for example, and next month when we talk about it, I want to see this sort of level of progress. So you can do that too. SMART targets are just reserved for annual meetings. And the final thing on setting objectives is that they have to come from the employee. So what I really don't particularly like seeing is when a manager has already pre-filled an appraisal form, for example, with the employee's objectives for the next 12 months. Because it comes back to owning that performance, owning that objective. That's not their objective, that's yours. And it's fine for you to have a team objective or a business objective, a departmental objective, but their individual objective needs to come from them and feed into your team objective, your departmental objective, your business objective. And it's up to you to steer that. So the first objectives certainly have to come from the employee. You steer it to match yours. And it's all about, like we said at the very beginning, that alignment to the business. If their suggestion does not align, then we rework it. And again, we explain why that doesn't work. So we make sure it's not a tick box exercise, that we're just filling the objectives box with anything and everything about being a better person and whatnot. And it's certainly not, I will arrive to work on time. I've seen that before as well. That's not an objective, that's just a basic expectation. They have to turn to work on time, okay? And when we're thinking about managing performance again, either informally or formally, we would use a performance improvement plan, or a PIP, as commonly known as well. And a lot of people now start to think about a PIP as a punishment, as something to be ashamed of, something that highlights that they've not been very successful in achieving a particular goal and whatnot, or a particular area of their performance. It's nothing to be ashamed of, a PIP. All it is a structured approach to achieving our objective. That's all it is. It's just more structured. It's just more easy for you to keep an eye on, and easy for the employee to manage their own performance as well. It's definitely the two-way process in that you build it together and you structure it around perhaps the SMART target. You think about the structured conversation that we'd had previously, where we're thinking about what is the need, what is the gap, what are the timescales, what support and training do you need. But it's a balance at this point between support and challenge, and I think that's really important, because we're starting to move away from the purely supportive element to challenging that employee's performance, in that, are they pushing themselves hard enough? Is it a stretch target? So you might have heard of that, where we go from an achievable target to stretching a little bit over perhaps a longer term. But are the perhaps objections that we're getting from employees during this sort of meeting, where we're thinking about improving performance and giving feedback and challenging poor performance, are they giving us rubbish answers and explanations? Are they maybe trying to duck and dive a little bit? And this is where a manager, you peacock a little bit, not too much at this stage, but you definitely want to challenge and push back on them and say, well, is that right? How do you feel about it? Do you think that that's enough? And you're asking them again to own it. So we're using those open questions where we're talking about, how do you think you can improve? Tell me about what you think has gone wrong. What do you think has been good? What do you think you need to work on? Really getting them to open up. They're doing all the talking, and the challenge therefore becomes a little bit easier, because it's not a case of you saying you're rubbish. Obviously no one would ever say that, but a case of you're not doing very well, are you? This hasn't been achieved, has it? What are you going to do about that? Nothing, didn't think so. And that type of thing. We're really opening up the conversation. Now, I'm really sure that no one would use that sort of language, but you would be surprised when an employee gets under your skin. You go all crazy. I know it, don't worry, I've seen it. So I hope that's helped a little bit in terms of the informal process and some of the softer skills that you can use. Rebecca's now going to come in and we're going to start talking about capability procedure, and where we've gone from it being more of an informal approach, more of us trying to persuade and reward, but unfortunately we haven't seen any improvement, or we've not seen the improvement that we'd like. And now what do we do at that stage? Over to you, Rebecca.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, so as Jenny mentioned, I'm going to go through the capability procedure now. So really we want to go through, when is this relevant? So as you'll know, it's relevant where there's been a failure to meet performance levels. And as Jenny mentioned, we've tried resolving it informally, but it's simply not been possible. So what is the capability procedure then? The capability procedure is a formal process where essentially what we'll look to do is establish the reasons for underperformance with the employee. We'll also look to try and still provide them with a bit of support for improvement. So we might still set some expectations, timescales and actions through that formal process. But if the standards aren't being met, then it's at that point where we might be giving employees warnings of possible formal action then at that stage. And as Jenny mentioned earlier as well in the slides, that a fair process is critical to ensuring that if you do end up at dismissal stage on grounds of capability, that you've arrived there safely and following the correct process. So what I'll look to do when I go through the next set of slides is essentially work through what you need to do in order to achieve a fair dismissal. Okay, so where would you look to start? I think a good starting point, what I always think you should look to do is to refer to the employee handbook for your specific capability procedure. So your procedure normally and should really refer to a staged warning process. So as we've already gone through and as Jenny's mentioned, there is usually an informal stage of the process, and that's what we'd recommend you do in the first instance. So you have almost 4 stages to get through to the point where you're working towards then dismissal. So the informal stage would potentially involve daily management feedback, which Jenny's already mentioned, informal discussions regarding underperformance, where you potentially then you're looking to take meeting minutes, evidence, what's been discussed and agreed, and then going through to that PIP stage where you're doing the performance improvement plan, you're setting those expectations and the timescales in order to meet any actions that you're setting for the employee. But ultimately, if that doesn't work, then what you'll be looking to do is then progress to the more formal stages where you're then going through that stage warning process. Now, it still involves setting expectations and requiring improvements. When you get to the point of looking to sanction employees, you might then say, right, well, these are what, if you don't achieve these next sets within a certain timescale of the expectations to meet the level that is required, then essentially it's going to end up with warning the employee that you're going to be moving to the next stage in that warning process, and ultimately then dismissal if the employee fails to improve to the standard that you require. So ultimately, when you're looking at the formal capability procedure, I think it's easier to break it down almost into 3 steps. So the first step, as you would with any sort of conduct issue, would be to investigate the issue first when you start the formal procedure. And then you would move to, if you felt it was appropriate based on the evidence and the explanation the employee gives, then you would move to the formal capability hearing. And ultimately then the third step would be to arrive at the appropriate decision, whether that be to take no further action or to issue a sanction in terms of basically issuing them with a warning. But I think key to remember as well is just to ensure that there is a fair process throughout and that you're identifying those problems with the employee. So for example, the problem of failing to meet a target, or is it poor customer feedback? So basically the objectives that you've set for the employee at the outset, discussing those and identifying those with the employee. And then also looking at identifying the possible causes and whether there are any non-fault causes. So it's important to consider when you're going through this process other factors. For example, is performance really the issue here? So as part of the investigation, you might be exploring, is there anything else you need to consider? Is there any ill health or disability related conditions that you need to be aware of? Are there any childcare issues? Are the targets realistic that are being set back to the employee? Is there any harassment by managers? Are they deliberately targeting an individual? Which hopefully you wouldn't find arising in the workplace if you've got that clear and consistent approach to performance management that Jenny mentioned earlier. And also another consideration is it actually misconduct that the employee is unwilling to carry out their role rather than they actually can't carry out their role? And do you then, as part of that investigation, need to decide to take a different approach and go through the disciplinary route as opposed to the capability route? So those are all relevant things that you should look to consider as part of the surrounding circumstances, and then pull together all of the evidence supporting your position as to whether which route you're going to proceed down, and whether you need to progress to a capability hearing, or if there's other work for you to do as an employer, perhaps to investigate underlying conditions, whether there's other support you can put in place, whether it genuinely is something that is the employee's fault, or you need to do something a bit different rather than going through the capability procedure with them. So what evidence then would you need to pull together in order to support your position? There's quite a lot of information that would help and support an employer in being able to say, we're going down the right route here and we need to take it to perhaps a more formal approach in the capability hearing. So things like contracts of employment and job description would be relevant, because when you're looking to discuss with the employee and identify the problems in terms of their failures to meet targets, and poor customer feedback things, you can then align it with the job description and the contract as to what's expected of the employee. You can refer back as well to training records, appraisals, one-to-ones, and the PIP that you've used at the informal stage to say, this is the steps we've taken so far, this is what we've fed back to you, and what has been outlined in your performance improvement plan, and these are the company targets which haven't been met. So it's important that you've got all of that information, that you can then discuss it at that stage with the employee. And any records as well that you have of the employee failing to meet standards. So it might be, for example, sales figures, call logs or emails, where you can actually then set out to the employee, these are the occasions that something has happened or you failed to meet standard. And you can even identify then what the frequency level of those failures are as well. So it's really clear from the outset when you start this formal process and you're investigating what the issues are, and also what evidence you've got to back it up as well. So you then, the employee can provide you with any reasons or feedback or anything to support their position as to why that might have happened on those occasions. And then it will also help in terms of getting that evidence in deciding whether there's any action necessary. So when you're looking to conclude the investigation, there's a couple of things that you need to consider. You need to consider the information that's provided to you by the employee as part of their explanation as to the reasons why they might be failing to hit the targets or perform to the level expected. And also you can consider as well all of the other evidence that you've gathered. So all of that evidence I've just mentioned that you've been building up through the informal process and through your discussions with the employee. And then as part of that, you need to consider, as I mentioned before, whether it's conduct, poor performance, whether there's any medical capability that needs further investigation, and then essentially looking to decide whether there's any need to then take further action, so moving then to a capability hearing stage, or no action at all, essentially. And if you then do proceed to a formal hearing, then possibly what the outcome of that might be is a warning on the back of that. Okay, so mentioned a couple of times ill health and disability, and what needs to be considered here really is whether there is an underlying condition which could amount to a disability, and whether there's any link to the impact on the employee's capability. So it might be at that stage, because it is quite a complex area, we're not going to go into too much detail on the issue of disability, but it's something that you do need to bear in mind to take further advice if these issues arise. So it will depend on the facts and circumstances in terms of what our advice will be. And it might be that if there is a disability or underlying condition that is likely to amount to a disability because, you know, it's having a substantial and adverse impact on the employee's ability to carry out their day-to-day activities. And what you're looking at is whether that's lasted or likely to last 12 months or more, then there might be an obligation on you as an employer to consider reasonable adjustments. And reasonable adjustments and whether they're suitable or not in the circumstances can vary. And it will depend on the situation. And it could involve things like amending the company's normal capability policy, or reviewing the timescales that have been set and allowing a longer time period for that employee than you would ordinarily allow other employees, in order so then they can have the reasonable opportunity to improve. It might also be that you need to provide them with some sort of additional support and make a referral to occupational health to get any recommended adjustments, because each facts and circumstances of the employee will be different. And so it's just relevant, I suppose, as a flag more than anything to say, right, this is the point we need to take some further advice before proceeding down the formal route, because there are other things to consider and actions we might need to take. Otherwise, you could end up in a situation where you're failing to make reasonable adjustments, or you're discriminating against somebody if you actually go to the formal hearing and end up disciplining or warning someone as a result of that. Okay, so then step 2 would be the capability hearing itself. So you've done all of your investigation now, and let's say there's no further information to consider. It's quite straightforward. It's a case of, right, this person is underperforming. We've done everything we can to support them. We've gone through the informal process. There's been no improvement. There's no other considerations or action we need to take. Essentially, this person isn't able to do their job. They're incapable of improving to the standard and meeting the standards that we expect of them as an employee. So at that stage, what you would then look to do is invite them to a formal capability hearing. So you've carried out the investigation stage, you've carried out the investigation hearing, and now you're sending them another letter to invite them to a formal hearing, essentially saying, right, we've decided we now need to take this further. So what should your letter include when you're inviting an employee to a formal hearing? So it should include details like you would expect: date, time and place of the meeting. You should set out a detailed summary of the relevant information. So essentially, these are the allegations, these are the performance issues that we've identified. You might want to put in some examples there as well, just to say these are the dates that we've referred to previously, or the emails, and provide also details of any support given up to that date and any performance improvement plan that was agreed, and essentially provide any evidence and enclosed documents that we mentioned before, so those appraisals, one-to-ones, and outline the procedure that you're going to take now. So the possible outcome might be a warning. You can put that within the letter, because it's important that you set out what needs to be discussed and considered at that stage, and what essentially the consequence might be as a result of deciding to proceed to the capability hearing. And also it's important that you set out the right to be accompanied as well. So that employee will have the right to be accompanied to that meeting by a trade union representative or a colleague. Now, they don't have that right at the investigation stage, the investigation meeting, but often what employers do as standard practice is allow that anyway, as a matter of course, so somebody's attending with the employee. And then just moving on to the aim of the capability hearing and what points should be covered there. So it's important just at the outset for the employee to explain the purpose of the hearing, allow the employee an opportunity to respond to the concerns that have been set out in the letter and raised in the meeting, and provide their explanation as to what's happened, in order so you can consider then all of that information. And it's about identifying again the cause of the underperformance, agreeing, if there is any further support that's identified, what can be provided further down at this stage in the process, because ultimately, if there's no improvement, you might then be going to a final written warning and dismissal. So there's still opportunities here to allow the employee to improve and provide any additional support that's needed. And then you can discuss what the reasonable period is for improvement before you then essentially look to make a decision. So then moving on to the third step, and this is where you're looking then to decide, right, what essentially are you going to do on the back of all of the evidence, on the back of what the employees provided in that meeting, and then provide a written outcome in terms of your decision. So often in capability proceedings, the first stage, as I mentioned before, would be to give a first written warning and work through that stage process. It would then be, if there's no improvement, the final written warning, and then ultimately dismissal. But it's important to provide a written outcome, because you want to have there the evidence of what's been discussed during the meeting. You want to confirm what sanction has been given, so that there's been a first warning given, and also provide details to justify why that decision is reached and why you're saying that that's reasonable in the circumstances. So all of that will help when you're setting out in writing to justify, this is the reason we've arrived at this outcome and why you're being sanctioned and why we're moving through the capability process, because essentially you've not met the levels expected, and these are the steps we've already taken to deal with it informally and try and support you, but it's not working. So we now need to move to a more formal process. So in terms of content of what you want to include in that letter, you want to include the performance issues that have been identified. So there's a chain running through essentially your meetings and written correspondence to show this is what's happened. These are the steps that we've taken. These are the points that have been identified, and it's all consistent and ties well together then. And you can then set out as well what the employee has responded in response to the performance issues during the meeting, and confirm as well. I think it's really important to confirm how long that warning is going to last for. Usually you would say a first written warning would last for 6 months, then a final written warning, 12 months is the standard that you would put in there. And again, you'd then advise on next steps. This is what we are agreeing to do going forward, whether that be additional support, whether that be these are the steps that you now need to take to improve, the targets and the levels that you're then expecting the employee to achieve within a set time frame in order to avoid any further necessary action. So any further sanctions such as final written warning and dismissal. So then what would be important as well is to continue through the performance improvement plan process to set those clear objectives, timescales, and ensure that you get the employee's agreement and ask for that to be signed and returned. So it's clear that any objectives that are being set and any timescales that are being set and actions are agreed, and the employee is aware of what's being expected of them. And then finally, putting in the letter as well as a really important point, the right to appeal, because employees do have the right to appeal any decision that's taken on a formal basis, and then have that appeal heard by somebody that's independent to the process. So what I'll do now is just move on as well to the reasonableness of the decision and the relevant points to consider. And essentially there's quite a few points that would be relevant here just to work through in order to demonstrate that when you're working through the stage warning process and arriving at dismissal, you've been reasonable in considering and arriving at those sanctions throughout the process. So honest belief, what's meant by that is that you as an employer can demonstrate that you've genuinely concluded over a reasonable amount of time that the employee is incapable of meeting the standards that are expected of them. And what really helps with that is all of the evidence that you've gathered by the point that you arrive at the dismissal stage in order to demonstrate that there's been poor performance. So you've got all the notes of the informal process, you've got all the evidence from that stage, you've demonstrated, right, well, we've genuinely got an issue here that still isn't being addressed informally, so we're now going to have to take this through the formal procedure. And also that you've given that reasonable stage warning process and arrived at the decision ultimately that, well, this employee isn't going to improve. We've provided every support that we can. We've got the evidence that there's been no improvement, and ultimately it's led to that employee's dismissal. And what is a reasonable opportunity to improve depends on the issue at hand, really. There's no one size fits all. Each situation could be different, and I suppose that's where we come in. You can look to seek advice from us on particular cases, especially where they might be complex and there's a variety of issues. Then essentially you need to look at, well, what's reasonable in this circumstance based on the employee's job, based on the standards that are expected, how many issues and how complex are they, what timescale do we need to set here. And sometimes timescales can be set out in your capability procedure in terms of those types of steps that you need to take, so it's worthwhile having a look at that as well. And how long is a typical stage warning process? Again, there's no one size fits all, but I would say generally that it would be 3 to 6 months, but could be longer depending on the circumstances. Things that you'd need to take into account are, you know, length of service, whether there've been any previous performance issues, and then you can decide, you know, how long is that stage warning process going to take? When is it suitable to move on to the next stage once they've not met the timescale expected for improvement? What we often get asked is there any way to speed up the process? Because as Jenny mentioned before, it can be a lengthy process. There's no quick way to dismiss somebody on grounds of capability. It's probably one of the most difficult ways that an employee would be fairly managed out of the business, because it's with conduct, it can be more clear cut, and here you've got to allow an opportunity for the employee to improve before you start disciplining them. So there are some suggestions. It may be possible to speed up the process if you have more regular reviews. So if you have different target sets, the daily, weekly, monthly targets, and you're reviewing them, you obviously don't want to set targets or review periods that make it look like you are trying to speed through the process or you are harassing the employee to get to the stage of dismissal. But it can help if you say, right, well, these performance issues can be addressed on a daily basis by management feedback, as you normally would. And then what we'll do is, to provide you with extra support, we'll have a weekly meeting if you think that's appropriate. If the employee, you know, agrees, yeah, I think that would really help me try and improve. And then you set a monthly review date to basically say, right, where have we got to with those daily and weekly targets and that extra support we've been provided. So that's one way of doing it, but I think generally you still need to give at least 2 warnings in most situations in order to allow that time for the employee to improve. So there's not really a quick way of getting through the process. And, you know, the ACAS code as well, which you need to bear in mind when you're going through this type of capability process with an employee, also says that the employee should be given at least 2 warnings, unless perhaps it's something that is sufficiently serious, then that's a different circumstance to consider. And it mentions there as well, one of the questions on the slide is, can you jump to a final written warning for a first instance? Well, potentially yes, if it's sufficiently serious, if it has a really harmful impact on the business. For example, if there's a loss of a major contract or damage to the company's reputation, then potentially we can look to skip stages. And I'll go through in a little bit more detail as well, where you might be able to actually skip straight forward to dismissal, but those will be in exceptional cases. It'll be rare that you'll be able to rely on those cases and circumstances. And I would always suggest you seek advice from us before you look to skip stages, because it will be difficult potentially if you do arrive at a dismissal stage to justify why you've done that, if there's not a particular exceptional circumstance that has arisen there. So I'll just move on now to the circumstances which might apply where you can arrive at dismissal without giving any warnings. So I've got some case law for you here. I'll run through the case law. I'll try to keep it as brief as possible, just set out some facts and the main principles of it, because the cases can be quite lengthy in themselves when you're reading them. But this essentially, as I say, sets out the rare occasions and the exceptional circumstances where maybe you would be able to justify dismissing someone without actually warning them. So we've got on there the case of Aladair. Now, this is an interesting case, one I quite like. Jenny and I were discussing it earlier. And it's a case of a commercial pilot, and he was flying a plane and actually executed a faulty landing in good weather conditions, which seriously damaged the aircraft, but also there were passengers on the flight, so it placed the life of those passengers at risk. What the employer concluded as part of their investigation and moving to the formal capability process was that the accident was due to a lack of flying knowledge, and therefore they dismissed the employee as they believe that he lacked the capability to fly a plane to the required standard. And the employment tribunal confirms that that was fair in the circumstances, because the degree of skill required is so high for a position like that, and the consequences of the smallest departure from his ability to fly the plane correctly is so serious, given that, you know, the damage to the aircraft, the financial cost, and the lives of the passengers that was placed at risk, meant that this one-off failure in the employee's performance could actually justify his dismissal in the circumstances. So this just demonstrates that there are rare cases where a one-off act will mean that you can dismiss an employee, but of course I don't think we've got any plain flyers here.
I'm just thinking that. I think it is a really interesting case, but we don't have any airline clients.
We don't have any airline clients. But I think it helps just to demonstrate when you come into a really skilled role that is putting people's lives at risk, that's how serious and exceptional and rare the case needs to be in order to be able to say, right, we're not going to bother with any warnings, we're going to move straight to dismissal. Another case is the case of Clark, which perhaps actually will be a little more relatable. And this is the case of an experienced car mechanic who negligently left an oil seal in place in a car, and the purchaser of the car drove away with the car for 11 miles before the engine and the rear wheels locked and the car was no longer fit for purpose. So dismissal in these circumstances, again, was fair because of the potential danger to the purchaser and the public, in terms of causing an accident, the car locking up and just stopping, and the damage also to the employer's reputation. So again, here dismissal was considered justified in the circumstances. So I've just got a couple more cases just to go through. The case of James. This was a case where an employee complained that his duties had been reduced over time, but he failed to provide details of how his duties had reduced. He refused to engage with the employer on this and became disrespectful and started inadequately performing his role. So the employer dismissed him without any prior warnings or an opportunity to improve. And the tribunal held that the dismissal was fair, even though there weren't any warnings or an opportunity to improve, because it essentially would have been futile. It would have been no benefit. The employee wouldn't have changed his ways. It wouldn't have meant he improved his performance. It was obvious due to I suppose it was a mix of conduct and capability in these circumstances, and the employer had lost confidence in his ability to perform his duties satisfactorily. So continuing to employ him wouldn't have been in the interest of the business, and therefore the employer was justified in dismissing him in the circumstances without any prior warning. And then just slightly different is the case of Laycock, which relates to senior employees and the approach employers might want to take in those circumstances. So the employee was employed as a yard manager originally, and after 2 years was promoted to managing director, but received a number of complaints about the way in which he dealt with customers, which resulted in business being lost. And the position of the company at the time wasn't great in terms of its business position. So the employer dismissed him without any warning, and it was again held to be fair. Now the reason for that was because the formal warning process isn't necessarily decisive in fairness in exceptional and rare circumstances. So it will be in most cases, which is why you have the stage warning process. But for senior employees, they're more likely to be aware of the lack of satisfaction that the employee may have in their performance. So it may not be necessary to give them warnings due to the very position that they hold. So that's what those cases confirm. And as I say, again, exceptional and rare cases, I can't advocate that enough. So just moving on to the last couple of cases then, and whether as an alternative to dismissal, the company should consider other employment, alternative employment within the business if that's available. And there's just a couple of cases there on the screen, but which I'll go through, but generally there's no absolute obligation on the employer to offer employment elsewhere in the business. There's no absolute obligation to offer them a previous role that they've held and performed well at, unless that's already been agreed, perhaps as part of the promotion, that they'll revert to that role if it doesn't work out. And there's no absolute obligation to demote an employee rather than dismiss them, but those are considerations that you can have as a company if you want to retain the employee, but perhaps in a more suitable position. And you may need to consider whether redeploying them or demoting them is something that you want to progress with rather than dismissing them. In particular, have a look at your company handbook, because if it's in the company handbook that you'll consider those options, you need to at least apply your mind to it and then justify why in an outcome you felt that either redeployment or demotion wasn't suitable in the circumstances and that there was no alternative but to dismiss the employee. So in the case of Gare, what was confirmed there was really that that the tribunal will consider what is reasonable in the circumstances and will also consider the size and resources of the employer. So in this case, the company was a small employer and it was held that they weren't obliged to demote or consider alternative employment despite the employee having 11 years of good service. And then in the case of Samvardi, it was confirmed by the tribunal that demotion was not automatic and that the employer can exercise discretion even where the handbook confirms demotion can be an alternative to dismissal. So if the employer determines, well, demotion isn't going to work because of the circumstances, for example, it might be that the employee is a poor communicator or has been failing to motivate the team, and that's had a negative impact on the team, the working environment, and you really being able to drive the business forward, then you can see in those circumstances why demotion wouldn't work, because they're still not going to be able to effectively communicate with the team. There still might be a failure to motivate, and that's going to continue to impact on the business and driving the business forward. So in that case, the employee, again, the dismissal was fair because he was working in a managerial position, wasn't communicating effectively, and essentially demotion just would not have worked in the circumstances of that case. So that's everything from me from a legal perspective. I hope that has been useful and helpful. And I'm going to hand back over to Jenny now just to cover the last few points.
Yeah, we're on the home run, guys, you'll be pleased to know. And I just wanted to cover off one of the points that I don't think we had touched on was 2 years service and whether we still needed to apply sort of performance management capability when we're thinking about employees with short service. The answer is no, you don't have to do that. And realistically, from my point of view, if you're thinking about a new member of staff, they'll obviously automatically usually have a probation period. That's a key time for you to monitor performance, obviously during that period of time, to an increased level. However, rule of thumb, if you don't think that an employee is going to improve to a standard in that 2-year bracket that you want them to, rather than wait until 2 years service and 1 day and then start the capability process, do it before 2 years. But make sure that you've tried all the informal routes first of all to really monitor them closely. And if you've got that genuine belief that they're not going to improve and have been speaking to them and in dialogue with them about that, then don't wait until after 2 years. If there's any suspicion, make sure that you're dealing with it before that 2-year period, because as we've discussed throughout, this is a staged process and therefore potentially a lengthy way to get to exit of an employee. We often though find that whether you're informal or in a formal process, that you might have issued a warning or you might have had a quiet word with your employee, and we've got a few different scenarios as to either first of all how they react, but then how they actually then start to perform going forward. So we have the employee that initially improves and everything's great. The danger there is, as a manager, you will just leave them to crack on with it because you think everything's resolved. We shouldn't do that. We should continue to monitor their performance, but perhaps over a period of time distance our meetings with them and create that more gap, so we can make sure that they know that we're still just around the corner ready to speak to them about their performance, but we're not perhaps as micromanager as we were before. But we shouldn't just on the first instance see that they've performed and then leave them alone, because they will fall back. It's a bad habit sometimes in some instances, so we need to make sure that we're continuing to have those review periods with them. Then we get the employee that likes to play the system. The improvement will completely lapse after the expiry of a warning, and you think, oh God, they've really just played me there. That, in a sense, first of all, from a manager's point of view, is really infuriating because you feel like they've got one over on you, and perhaps they have in this instance, but it means that maybe there was something going on in terms of perhaps even looking inwardly at your management style. Were you actually monitoring them? Was the time frame too short? Was the time frame too long? Were the targets that you set and objectives that you set not stretch enough for them? And therefore, we perhaps need to be addressing that next time. However, if you do find conveniently that it does lapse, improvement does lapse after the one, we go straight back into the process again. And perhaps rather than looking at the informal process, that first instance, if it's a nice coincidence that it's like a day or two after, or even a few weeks after, perhaps for me, I'd be going straight back into that formal process and saying, well, this is convenient, please can you explain what's happened? And really keeping that pressure up and moving away from support and that angle to more of the challenge. What you also are considering, has the previous warning expired? So if you do something else on there, can you build on this? Can you be looking at that to consider that? Is it a similar incident? And therefore, can you be taking that into consideration when you're thinking about sanctions? Or is the previous warning still live in that situation? And as such, the same considerations need to be made, really. But it's all about continuing to manage. It is a little bit more labour intensive for you guys when we're thinking about management of staff. And obviously we all want, you know, rose-tinted glasses and the world to be perfect when it comes to workforce management. But unfortunately, we do still need to make sure. Thanks, Julie. No problem. Off you go. See you soon. In summary, then, essentially, it's some of the key points that we need to pick up. Rebecca, if you just want to pop onto my next slide, please. Thank you. We've got to think about regularly reviewing employees and making sure that we are having one-to-ones. Now, a lot of businesses have one-to-ones every month. Some businesses have one-to-ones every week. It really depends on what is good for you, your business, your staff, your team, your objective completely. But realistically, as a minimum, I would like to suggest that you have an annual appraisal, so one meeting a year. And then in that, you have a minimum of 3 structured one-to-one meetings. And that way, it works out that you're meeting an employee quarterly as a minimum, and have that period of time so that you can actually make sure that the appraisal meeting itself is not that surprise, it's that summary. So for me, that's a minimum. However, if you do want to have monthly one-to-ones, make sure that you've got something to say in them and that they've got something to say as well, because then the meetings become fruitile, or is that the right word? Yeah, futile, not fruitile. Oh, that's a good word, isn't it? I've just made up a new one. Fruitile, like kiwis. No. And you need to think about what you're actually going to say, and make sure they're really flexible as well. I want to think, because there's no point in having a set hour in a diary if it's only going to take 10 minutes. Allow enough time, but if the conversation and that one-to-one in that month only takes 15 minutes, that's fine. If you've had a really good conversation, 15 minutes, fine. If the next time it takes an hour, that's also fine. It's not about quantity, it's about quality when it comes to one-to-ones, and documenting what was said and the action points out of that. Thinking about setting those SMART objectives, very important to focus the mind and drive that performance, have that goal. People like to work towards a goal. Certainly when we're thinking about lockdown and contextualizing that, it's important that we have something to work towards, whether that be a return to work, a return to normality, thinking about something that we're trying to achieve. People as individuals, a human race, we like to have something to work towards. So therefore, if we're setting that objective as part of the performance management process, it is really good practice. And that effective feedback, and it's timely. It's following the EEC model. If they've done something fabulous, tell them straight away. Don't wait until the next one-to-one. If they've done something poor, definitely don't wait until the next one-to-one. If it's important enough, we will speak to them straight away. If it's just as a bit of a side note, then perhaps wait for the one-to-one. We're not USA, but we're using the capability procedure for performance, and we're not being afraid to use that. A lot of businesses are concerned about using capability because, as we've said, it's not a quick route to exit, and often that is their primary motivation that they want to get to. But if we just stagnate and we allow employees to continue on the track of poor performance, then everybody else will perhaps think that that bill is getting away with it, and therefore it becomes inconsistent use of process again. So make sure we're consistently applying it for everyone. It is a bit more labour intensive for you guys as managers, but we are here to support you. It's something that we can help you through and hold your hand all the way through that process if needs be. And make sure that we're thinking about reasonable adjustments in the event of a disability being raised, or general just support mechanisms if it's not a disability, if there's just another reason for the poor performance, on what we could look to. Now, Bernard actually raised an interesting question, that's something about disability and thinking about ill health, particularly if an individual was overplaying an ill health condition as a reason for their a poor performance. It does happen, and you will often find that an employee will think of anything under the sun other than the real reason as to why they are not performing. The key to, if you've got a suspicion in relation to ill health and it being overplayed, is to get as much detail as possible. Ask the employee, as you would in a welfare meeting, how does that affect you day to day? And specifically, how does it affect you achieving the objective that you've been set? Really drill down on that. You'll often find that if an employee is perhaps malingering in relation to ill health, that they will start to flap a little bit as they're put on the spot. If we find that they're holding their ground and therefore potentially a genuine illness, we would be seeking medical evidence on that, asking them to go to occupational health in relation to that. So we could essentially eradicate that as a reason as to their poor performance. It could be if they're now saying they can't do their job because of their ill health, that we're still looking to do a capability process, but we're following the ill health capability, and therefore are we saying that they can't do their job at all because of their condition, and therefore are we going to exit them that way? So all is not lost if an individual does say that they have an ill health condition, but obviously we're still remembering the support and challenge.
Yeah,
so that,
I was just gonna add to that, Jenny, and just say I think it's really important just to, as Jenny says, just to drill down and make sure that you're asking the right questions. And we're quite happy to support if this happens with the relevant questions that you need to ask. So questions like, you know, how long have you had this condition? How does it impact on your performance? You know, have you had any support from your GP or any information that would help us identify any adjustments that you might need? Is there anything that you can suggest that support we can put in place that might help you with your performance? And it's just about identifying with the employee what support they think they need, and essentially, as Jenny mentioned, if it's a case of you can't really drill down and get the necessary information, or you feel that you need some expertise in the area to get some recommended adjustments, then a referral to occupational health would really help with that, because they can identify, is there any adjustments that you might be able to make? But ultimately, it's then the employer's decision as to whether those adjustments are reasonable. Because if you're going to look to be changing the role to such an extent, or changing the performance parameters to such an extent that essentially it's a different role or it wouldn't work for the company, then that won't necessarily be reasonable in the circumstances. And again, if you get to the stage of an occupational health report, we can look to assist with that and review any recommendations and how you implement that, and work with the employee to achieve what you need to, whilst potentially still then progressing through the capability process. Because as Jenny said, if they're incapable of carrying out their role, you still might end up in a situation where you end up at dismissal, but you've done everything you can to try and support that employee and ensure that they're not disadvantaged by their disability.
Great, thanks so much, Rebecca. So that does bring us to the end of the performance management workshop. As Kane mentioned at the outset, we'll be hovering around if anyone does need to stay on and ask us any specific questions about anything you're dealing with. But it has been an absolute pleasure to see so many friendly faces today, and it's really nice doing these workshops with you guys. So thanks very much for having us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. I think what day it was then. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
So I think that's everyone.
Yeah.
Well, that was great, guys.
Thank you.
Yay.
Went really fast, I think, and we were bob on time.
Yeah.
Definitely the only one so far that's been on time.
Yes. We're
I
proud.
learned after my first one where we went